So last time we looked at this argument against racialism, which is the view that races are basically hidden structures and distinct race groups have distinct hidden structures. The argument against racialism turns on the premise that there are no relevant hidden structures, which is supported by the claim that there's no evidence for relevant genes. So we dismissed racialism, and now we can look at the next view on which races exist. It's the view that they're grounded in our causal history, not in hidden structure. So the idea here is, rather than two people, A and B, counting as members of the same race group because they share the same hidden structure, those two people, A and B, count as members of the same race group if they come from the same breeding population, where a breeding population has to be kind of an isolated breeding population. So over some long period of time, there's a fairly small number of individuals, say in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, who are only breeding with one another over, say many centuries. That would be an isolated breeding population. So what's the argument against racial population naturalism? It goes like this. For any kind term K, if a proposed definition of K implies that it refers to a certain set of things, the extension of a term is just the things it refers to. So if a proposed definition of K implies that it refers to a certain set of things, but how we're disposed to apply K suggests that it applies to a different set of things. And there's very little overlap between those two sets. So the proposed definition says the set looks one way, the set of things the term refers to looks one way, and our intuitions say, our dispositions to apply the term say that it's an entirely different group of things the term applies to. Then the proposed definition fails. So the idea here is that a proposed definition has to capture some of our kind of pre-theoretic sense about how the term works, about what it applies to. And that's an interesting semantic thesis. We're not going to talk about it a lot here. We will mention it a little bit later on. But for now, I want to focus on the second premise. And the second premise is this. The extension of race terms according to racial population naturalism has very little overlap with the extension suggested by how we're disposed to apply race terms. Therefore, racial population naturalism fails. Now, why do we say this? Well, let's take two groups in the United States, African Americans and the Pennsylvania Dutch. The Pennsylvania Dutch have been an isolated breeding group for hundreds of years. So according to racial population naturalism, they count as a distinct race from, say, Dutch people from Europe, or other, say, what we would call white people from Pennsylvania. Well, that doesn't fit how we normally use race terms. Normally, if you're checking a box on a form, a Pennsylvania Dutch person, we would say, should check the race box for white. So our ordinary disposition to apply race terms doesn't fit with this result of racial population naturalism, which says that the Pennsylvania Dutch are a distinct race from other non-Pennsylvania Dutch white people in Pennsylvania, as well as from people from the Netherlands. What about African Americans? Well, racial population naturalism says that African Americans are not a race because they're not an isolated breeding population, not over a long enough period of time, and not really at all. Why? Because people who are of African descent and have been in the United States for even a few decades often have bred with people who are of European descent. In fact, during slavery, rape was pervasive in the United States. Slaves were, regularly raped by their owners, and that's part of the reason why nearly all descendants of slaves are partly European. That is, their ancestry, their near-term ancestry, is partly European, where near-term means over the last several hundred years. So on racial population naturalism, African Americans do not count as an isolated breeding group, but the Dutch do. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what intuition suggests about who counts as a race and who doesn't. And more generally, when you look at racial population naturalism and how it classifies people, it's just going to be radically mismatched with our ordinary applications of race terms. So if premise one is true, then this conclusion just falls out. Racial population naturalism is false. whether premise one is true or not is a very interesting question. Some people like Rudolf Carnap has proposed that, and Sally Haslinger picks up on this in the article for this week as well, he's proposed that the goal of philosophy of language and semantic investigation more generally isn't to uncover pre-existing meanings for terms. It's rather to stipulate the most valuable meanings for terms, the most fruitful meanings for terms in Carnap's view. In Haslinger's view, the most politically useful meaning for terms. So it's not to uncover antecedently encoded meanings for terms. It's rather the goal is to invent new ones and invent them according to Carnap if they lead to useful theorizing, invent them according to Haslinger, choose them according to Haslinger based on how well they advance certain political goals, how useful they are in that respect. Well, if you have that kind of view, then you won't be so concerned about overlap with previous uses of terms. So you might reject premise one. But notice if you reject premise one for that reason and preserve racial population naturalism for that reason, then race talk in the technical sense, when people are talking about race, when they're using this racial population naturalist version of the view race, will have nothing to do with ordinary race talk. So you meet someone on the street and they say that person's a member of one race group, that person's a member of a different race group. When they're using the word race, it's just a totally distinct kind of use than someone who would be using it in the racial population naturalist sense. So it's just like Moneybank and Riverbank. They're that different. They have nothing to do with each other. If you accept one, then you accept that they don't count as the same word unless the extensions overlap a bit. And there's a nice debate between Carnap and Peter Strawson about this. And Carnap sort of turns out to be ambivalent by the end of the debate. He thinks maybe we should try and preserve ordinary intuitions about usage a bit. At any rate, let's assume that premise one is true, then racial population naturalism isn't a plausible view of race. And if we get rid of that assumption, we can say this: racial population naturalism isn't a plausible view about the referent of ordinary race talk, the reference of the meaning of ordinary race talk. Next up, we have racial constructionism. Racial constructionism says that races exist, but they're grounded in our social practices. They're not grounded in anything independent of us. They're not grounded in hidden structures. They're not grounded in causal histories. They're grounded in how we treat each other, how we think about each other, how we talk about each other. And we'll look at that view next time.